and recommendations with respect to the August 29th airstrike near the Hamid Karzai International Airport in Afghanistan. As you know, the general was tasked by Secretary of the Air Force Frank Kendall to conduct a review and investigation of that strike. He has completed that work. He has briefed it out to senior leaders here at the Pentagon, to include the Secretary, and now he's prepared to talk to you about his findings and what some of his recommendations were going forward. He will take questions after that. I will, as before, be up here to moderate them, so I will call on you and we'll try to get to as many people as we can in the time that we have. So with that, General Saeed.
Thank you, sir. Take my mask off here. So folks, good afternoon. Appreciate a few minutes of your time. So this investigation was directed by the Secretary of Defense, who asked the Secretary of the Air Force to designate a 3-star to conduct it. I was chosen to do it, but it came in the direction of the Secretary of Defense and ultimately went back to the Secretary of Defense. The whole point of it in selecting me is to make sure it's independent. I'm nowhere close to the strike. I'm the Department of the Air Force Inspector General, so that we conduct a thorough and independent investigation of what happened and why it happened. We did not rely on any previous investigations or analysis that had been done up to that point. We rebuilt what happened from the ground up. That's critically important, because for us to make conclusions and recommendations, we have to be confident in the underlying data. So we reconstructed everything from the ground up. We did review what was done before, but we certainly didn't rely on it. And that included pulling all the imagery, all the intel streams, interviewing 29 individuals, 22 directly involved with the strike and under oath. The report of investigation is classified, and I know you're probably not happy about that, but let me tell you, it has to be, because the methods, sources and methods and tactics, techniques and procedures used in executing such strikes are classified. And for me to figure out what happened with any level of confidence, I have to deal with this classified material. So overall, the report is classified. I'm going to do my best to give you the data that you need, the insights that you need, and I'll be as transparent as I can, mindful of the fact that we're in an unclassified setting here. If you had the report in front of you, the front end of it, at least a page, is about the context at the time. And it's important to preface what I'm about to say in terms of conclusions with that, because the thing I want to say up front is this strike was unique. So as I'm talking you through it, if you try to equate it or correlate it to strikes you're familiar with, classic over-the-horizon CT strikes, you would be comparing apples to oranges. So please don't do that. It was unique in the sense that it was a self-defense strike, executed in self-defense, unlike what you're accustomed to, which is by far the norm, where you have a long time to do things like pattern of life, you have days to assess the intelligence and determine how you're going to execute the strike. It's a very different construct and very different execution. So I wouldn't conclude anything from this particular strike, which was very unique, to the norm that is exercised with over-the-horizon CT strikes. And I mentioned the fact that the report is classified, so bear with me on that. So let me give you some highlights, and then we'll get to Q&A quickly so I can see what's on your mind. One is, I don't think you'll be surprised that, as the department has already acknowledged, the report confirmed that the strike resulted in the death of 10 Afghan civilians, including 3 men and 7. The investigation made 3 recommendations. They were broad enough but important enough based on the analysis of in the investigation of what didn't go as well as it could have. And the recommendations are unique to this type of strike, which again is very time constrained. It's not what you're used to in the over-the-horizon CT strike, where you have time to soak a target, do pattern of life. This is a self-defense strike because the vehicle was getting closer and closer to HKIA and got within 3 kilometers and was perceived to contain explosives, and thus an imminent threat to U.S. forces on HKIA. But the recommendations are focused on this type of strike where the time is constrained, the scenario is dynamic, and it's in an urban terrain. And let me just give you the highlights of them. The first one, we can talk in detail what they mean if you want, but the first one is implementing procedures in a strike cell where if we find ourselves in a similar situation where we're time constrained, conducting strikes very quickly because of the need to exercise self-defense in urban terrain, and we're trying to interpret or correlate intelligence to what we're seeing in a rapid fashion, implementing procedures to mitigate the risk of confirmation bias, which we can talk more about that is why it was of interest in this particular case. The second recommendation is enhancing situational awareness by sharing information that is very thoroughly shared within the confines of the strike cell and within a bubble within that strike cell, but sharing that situational awareness and analysis more broadly across the strike cell, but also outside to elements supporting the strike cell from elsewhere. That additional information will enhance overall situational awareness and will provide better insight and better cross-check of what exactly are we looking at, what are we seeing, what else could it be, are we interpreting the intelligence in an appropriate way or not. So that sharing of information can be approved and should be. And the last, I mentioned that the assessment of the presence of civilians, specifically children, in the compound was inaccurate. So recommended a review of how that assessment is conducted, again, under rapid strikes, where you're exercising something in a time-constrained fashion for more deliberate, lengthy days, type strikes, which you're accustomed to. I think that's pretty tight because you have the luxury of time. You don't have the luxury of time when you're perceiving something to be an imminent threat that's approaching you. And you need to have lockdown procedures of how we might be able to improve that to pick up on what's there. We've shared at the direction of the Secretary of Defense, who owns this report. This report was shared with the operational commanders, so they can assess the recommendations within and decide what else they might want to do to implement corrective measures. It was also shared, again, by the direction of the Secretary of Defense with the chain of command, so they can assess the analysis within and determine if, as appropriate, if any accountability is appropriate. They can see in excruciating detail exactly what played out and how it played out, and if performance-wise it didn't meet their bar, that's commander business, and that's why we refer such investigations to the chain of command. They've only had it for 2 days, right? So it's not like they've had it for a while. They've had it for 2 days, and they're digesting it to try to work through that. I do need to mention something, because we're also asked to look at the initial investigation and the messaging that followed. And I'm talking specifically to the 15-6 and what we initially messaged versus what we eventually evolved to, and then what I'm telling you right now, and what caused that. So you can imagine, given the severity and the significance of the strike, there was a high desire to get information as soon as possible, not only to the chain of command, but up to the DC AOR, the Pentagon, to you all, to the public, to the Hill. So the investigation was conducted, but the investigation was conducted very quickly, again, with pristine intent to provide information as quickly as possible. But the time frame it was conducted was insufficient to drill down sufficiently to provide sufficient insight and reach conclusions that are really sound and based on facts. So I didn't find any indication at all of anybody slow leaking information or twisting information. It was merely investigation done. It was appropriate and justified for everyone to assume that investigation contained accurate information, and we all thought that, right? But when you look back at it as to what else could have been done, I'm just telling you, I don't think anybody could have done a better job in 4 to 5 days. It's just not possible, right? It takes more time to do such work because it's very complicated, and I just want to put that out to make sure that you all understand why the messaging was different at first. And I'll leave you with this, and then we'll go to Q&A. Look. We had the benefit of time to conduct this review. I used the same data that folks conducting the strike on the day of the strike had. That's the only fair thing to do, right? We can't second guess with additional information that they didn't have. Although I did look at that to see if there was something they should have had that they didn't have. There's not much of that would have made a difference. But I had the luxury of time to review that data over weeks. They didn't. right? They had the same data, but they had to assimilate it, digest it, and make a decision in a matter of hours. So I have to acknowledge that yes, when I had weeks to figure it out and do analysis and reach conclusions, I've highlighted the breakdowns for you, but they seem simpler now than they were at the time, given the time constraints. So let me stop at that, because I don't want to keep babbling for too long, and maybe take some of your questions.
Rita?
Hi, General. Can you say whether any of the evaluation you found made this avoidable, if any of those changes had been made? Would this have been avoidable? And you're saying you found no illegalities. Why no discipline? Why did you find that there was no one needing discipline when it was such a major failure?
Yeah, no, great questions. Let me hit the second one first, because I'm sure that's on everybody's mind. Let me just be upfront. I didn't eliminate the possibility of accountability. That is commander business. What I concluded at our level in this investigation, that I didn't find violations of law or law of war. I didn't find, when I was doing a process review, remember this is about the strike and the process, had I found an individual that failed to perform to the level of criminal misconduct or criminal negligence, and that was the cause of failure for this whole thing, we would have spun that off into a separate investigation into an individual. So, and that we were eyes wide open to go, did any individual rise to that level that we're going to spin off an investigation, a criminal investigation or a misconduct investigation? And what I found is the disconnects were an aggregate process breakdown in which many people are involved. And it wasn't any particular individual that was causal to that. Certainly nothing rose to the level of criminal conduct. Break. The fact that I've sent this to the chain of command, that's where it belongs. It doesn't mean the chain of command will read it and say, I'm not doing anything. They could read it and go, this is subpar performance. It's not an objective assessment. There isn't a checklist to go, if you do this, it's okay. If you do that, it's not okay. But they can go, this is subpar performance, and decide to take adverse action. They can decredential folks. They can retrain folks. They can fire folks. They can do a variety of different things. So you should not perceive the fact that I didn't call any individual out with accountability. That does not mean that the chain of command won't. And to your second point, I can't play hypotheticals and say if we implement the recommendations, we're guaranteed this will never happen again. Here's what I will tell you. Based on the circumstances in this particular strike, which is a very unique strike under self-defense, and I told you the constraints of that, these measures will go a long way to greatly mitigate the risk of this happening again, because they all contributed to the ultimate strike, right? So these measures will allow us to kind of mitigate the risk of confirmation bias. The situational awareness will enhance the collective in trying to question what is it that we're looking at and what are we interpreting, and will also help us in the analysis of individuals at the strike area when you're conducting a rapid strike, not the strikes you're used to over the horizon CT.
Two questions. Where did the process break down?
Yes, sir.
And in the original explanation of what went wrong, it all tracked back to that Corolla being seen at a location that was associated with ISIS, and everything after that seemed to be confirmation bias. So was that original determination that that car, which actually was at that guy's place of work, that was in an ISIS location? Was that the original flaw from which everything else followed?
Yes, sir, but with some nuances. So let me walk you through that. This is a critical point. So the question for everybody is, how did this particular vehicle become the vehicle of interest that we ultimately struck? And it's what I alluded to before. It boiled down to the interpretation of intelligence available and trying to correlate it to what you're seeing in real time, and trying to determine, is the intelligence giving you enough information to conclude that this area or this particular compound and associated vehicles are the compound and vehicles of interest, right? There's an art to that. It's not pristine. It's not always totally accurate. There's interpretation involved. But to your point, that is how it started. There was intelligence available to say that correlated the corolla to particular locations, and the way it was interpreted is this was the corolla of interest. Now, obviously incorrectly in hindsight. But it didn't stop there. When I'm talking about confirmation bias, the initial correlation, I think if you all saw it in a classified setting, would be reasonable to conclude that that should be a vehicle of interest, right? And I think that would be very, very reasonable given the information that you're having, that you're receiving, and you're trying to assess. But what transpired over 8 hours, cumulative, right, is the observed pattern of movement, the observed behavior and activity, that all has to aggregate and connect with intelligence to see, is it reaffirming that this is truly the vehicle of interest, to reach a point where you're so confident that you're going to strike it. One of the recommendations that goes to this issue, central to this issue, is red teaming, if you will, to break confirmation bias by somebody going, you can interpret the intelligence in a way that leads you to further believe that this is the vehicle of interest, but you can also interpret it as benign. So somebody pushing back to break the confirmation bias and a red team function, if you will, and dedicated red team function going, hey, it could be this, but it could also be that. Why do we think it's this? Because human nature, we've all seen it, right? Everybody knows what confirmation bias is. When you consciously or subconsciously start to perceive something and you go, that is a suspicious person, every activity they take thereafter, you start seeing it through that lens. And what to me, not knowing that you might be a suspicious person, appears totally benign, to you, where you have this preconceived notion based on information that you have, you might be suspicious, you start reading that activity as, yeah, that is affirming of suspicious behavior. That actually happened during the 8-hour window. There were instances where the intelligence was being correlated to real-time information, or what was being observed in a way that we could have had a chance to inject and go, what else could this be? I know you could interpret it this way, but what about this? So to your point, though, that is accurate. There was intelligence that led us to believe that was the corolla of interest, but as we all know, and as I said, it's not.
So when you say there was a breakdown of process, is that because there was nobody to push back?
So it's a combination of things, right? So I made 3 recommendations for a reason. It's not just one thing. This is how the ball started rolling, if you will, of what made it a vehicle of interest, and over time made it a high enough interest vehicle that the threshold to strike it was met. But I also said information sharing laterally, not only within the strike cell, but outside to supporting elements, could have produced situational awareness that would have helped the strike cell in avoiding this CIFCAS. And last but not least, and this is critically important, obviously the clearing and determining who is in the strike area in the compound where we struck it also needs to be reviewed. So it's not a one thing, but if you were saying causal factor, that's what started the ball rolling, for sure.
What could they have learned if they had gone outside the strike cell?
So again, I need to be careful in what I share on classification, but let me just give you as much as I can. Where that would have come in helpful is the awareness of the imminence of the likelihood of imminence of the strike would have allowed folks to provide additional context and information that might have been helpful to maybe delay the strike for a few minutes, do additional clearing of the target area. But the information sharing laterally and certainly outside the strike cell was not optimum. It could definitely be improved. Again, I'm sorry I'm being slightly vague, or quite a bit vague. It's just to avoid the classification. This would be much, much easier in a classified setting.
I just want to follow up a little bit about what you just said. Are you saying that if they had stepped outside the bubble and consulted people, they may have learned that a strike on troops was not as imminent as they thought it was?
No.
And they couldn't?
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
So there was nowhere to step outside the bubble and ask somebody, and somebody will say it's not. Okay. It's imagine yourself sitting in the strike cell. By the way, I have to say this. We're fixated on one threat. you have to realize that strike cell was dealing with multiple threat streams, tracking multiple vehicles at any given time, right? This is not the only thing they were tracking. But what they're trying to do is, as intelligence is coming in, they're trying to correlate what the intelligence is telling them to what they're seeing in their own eyes with the assets that are tracking. And they're trying to correlate, is that intelligence connecting to what we're seeing sufficiently so to conclude that is the vehicle of interest that's going to be involved in the attack on the 29th. If you had somebody sitting in the strike cell, the issue of confirmation bias, saying, look, you're correlating this piece of info to reaffirm that that is the vehicle, but what you're reaffirming in the activity you're seeing could be nefarious, if you will, but it could also be very benign. This is what it could be. Why are we not choosing to interpret? So pushing back a little bit, playing that dialogue to go, what is it exactly that we're looking at? To make sure, because it's hard when you're the one executing the strike to be in the second guessing mode at the same time when you're responsible for so many assets and targets that you're tracking. And it's only a factor, well, I say only, it's particularly a factor in this unique scenario, right? In the over-horizon CT strikes, when you have so much time and it's deliberate, and you're doing it over hours and days and you're soaking targets, it's less of an issue because there's a lot of time to have discussions and second guess and red team and walk around it. When you're doing a strike so rapidly, you need that, I'm convinced, you need that pushback to be sure that you're not interpreting something through a very biased lens, which is human nature, by the way. I put myself in the same scenario. If I started to perceive that car as a risk to U.S. forces, I will start to read what it's doing and its occupants throughout the day through that lens, because subconsciously I'm starting to think that's a threat. Somebody stepping back on that could be totally benign would challenge me enough for me to go, wait a minute, okay, let's slow down a bit. Why is it elevated to that level? Does that make sense? Very different.
In a situation like this where things are moving quickly and there is an imminent threat, how can you step outside and make that procedure better?
It's not step outside. It's you're sitting in this.
How can you institutionalize taking a
Yeah,
step
so
back?
that's what the operational commanders are currently assessing in the report to figure out in such unique circumstances. Again, I keep emphasizing this because you can't compare it to the 99.9% of strikes you're familiar with. This is unique. By the way, in the retrograde window over 4 months, this was the only strike conducted under self-defense. Actually, if you go back a year, I'm almost confident with this. In the last year in Afghanistan, we didn't do any self-defense strikes. So it is very unique, and the urgency is palpable, right? By the nature of the imminent threat. We're defending U.S. forces at HKIA, and it was only 3 kilometers away.
A couple things. Where was the strike cell that you're talking about? Where were they physically located?
It's.
Is it Qatar?
It is.
Okay. And since you rebuilt this from the beginning, when was it evident that there were kids at the compound in your timeline?
So the first time we had confirmation of kids was at the 2-minute time frame.
2 minutes before the impact?
Before the trigger pull.
Oh, so it was before the missile, the
Yes,
Hellfire
yes.
was launched?
Yes, but I gotta, I'll give you some data here. So, just to be fair, and this is important, when we review available video feeds at the time, we did independent analysis by 2 separate teams to see what they see in the video. And I have to preface with this context, it's critically important. Had I been able to find anybody on the planet that's a trained screener or image analyst, those are the folks that view such things to determine, that didn't know that we had a CIVCAS event on the 29th, I would have chosen them to do the review. Because I'm telling them, review this video, and you don't know what you're looking for, tell me what you see. I couldn't do that. Just to be fair here in context, they knew they were looking for kids. That's very different when you're sitting down to review something. You know what you're looking for, and you're being very attentive to that. But I couldn't find anybody that didn't know. So they're predisposed to looking for kids. We have to understand that context. But 2 independent reviews that I conducted for this investigation, the physical evidence of a child was apparent at about the 2-minute point. But I'm just telling you, I put eyes on myself. I just didn't have it. I mean, they're doing it for me, but I had to see it for myself. I'm just saying, it is 100% not obvious. You have to be like, no kidding, looking for it. But when you're looking for it, certainly after the fact, if you ask me, was there evidence of a presence? Yes, there was.
So just to be clear, 2 minutes before the launch?
Yes.
Not 2 minutes before impact?
Yes.
Okay. And then just one more thing, the communication breakdown that you mentioned in your opening, I'm still unclear about exactly what that means. And can you explain a little bit more? Is that the sharing situational awareness? I just don't understand.
Okay, so good question. Let me just, let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Is if you're sitting there and your job is to track a particular target of interest, in this case a vehicle, and you're tracking it without specific information of what are we about to do with this vehicle? When is a strike imminent? Or we've been tracking it for 8 hours. What is it exactly that I'm looking for? What additional intel have you received that I need to be assessing outside of the strike cell? In the strike cell, it's pretty tight because you're sitting there in a room and people are talking out loud and everybody's hearing what's being shared. But even then, it's just in a smaller bubble because there's so many targets being tracked. When you're remote and outside the strike cell, all you have is communication via chat normally. It's not voice. It's chat. We're sharing like text on secure chat. If you lose the context of that is being built in the strike cell of here's new intelligence that's telling us to look for this. You're looking at it from a remote location. Here's what we should be seeing now. Are you seeing it? Here's what we intend to do and we're going to strike within a few minutes. If you lose that situational awareness, your ability to help the strike cell put context on what they're seeing greatly diminishes. And I'm being a little bit evasive because of the classification of some of the things, but it is a contributing factor. It's not like a make-believe thing. There was a disconnect in the level of situational awareness outside the strike cell that could have helped, was it if it was available. And frankly, it's one of the contributing factors to this assessment that I just mentioned to you about picking up a child. Had that situational awareness been more widely spread and acknowledged that, hey, look, we're getting so close to striking, folks that are looking at those images and trying to make sure that they clear, their sense of urgency and in clearing would be different. Because if you're looking at something for 8 hours, you're desensitized. Okay, we've been tracking it. We could be tracking it for 5 more days. But if you have enough SA to go, hey, we're starting to see this. It's starting to really becoming a threat. It is now a threat. It's an acknowledged threat. We're going to strike it. It's 2 minutes. Your urgency of what you're looking at, what you're trying to clear when it pulls into a brand new compound is just naturally different, right? As a human being, you would go, you're not desensitized anymore of, I've been doing this for 8 hours. What's different?
So to put it simply, is it fair to say that the people on the ground weren't sharing information enough with the strike cell back in Qatar, and that was the communication?
No. It's not the people on the ground because we didn't have anybody outside. It's the elements that are supporting the strike itself don't just sit in the strike cell itself. There's the strike cell, and then there are external elements that support it from other locations remotely. And I just recommended that the information that's available to the inner circle in the strike cell, because the strike cell is big enough and there's too many things going on that not everybody, even in the strike cell, is aware of the nuances. One, enhance it within the strike cell, make sure everybody knows everything about that target. But externally, when you're only messaging via chat, the folks supporting you remotely, make sure they have context that they don't have because they're not there with you. The only context you have is if you choose to share it with them via chat. I can't by osmosis pick it up because I hear you talking. I'm like, oh, another threat stream, and they said something else. Another thing, and I'm building my essay throughout the day by just sitting there, physically being there. Very different for somebody remote that is tasked to support the strike in a very significant way, but all they're getting is what is being shared via the text. It's called chat. There was a definite disconnect there that could have helped dramatically.
I'm going to go to the phones. I haven't done that yet. Alex Horton, Washington Post.
Hey, thanks for keeping me on. I wanted to go back to the idea of confirmation bias that you had mentioned, and the link to the earlier attack. at HKIA. Some defense officials have told reporters that, they believe there were explosives in the car based on the idea that those packages may have been the same size as the bomb used at HKIA, which I think is a link in their mind to, this strike happened at the airport, and therefore it's going to be another event. So can you speak to the confirmation bias of the attack at HKIA a few days before and the belief that they were connected? Did it lend to commanders or analysts the idea that this was likely just because there was an attack earlier?
No, I appreciate that question. I'm glad you asked it. It's a great question. I can give you a great example of what would be confirmation bias. So you all saw the reporting about the computer bag that was exchanged at the first location where the vehicle stopped. And that was significant. Significant for the reasons you're alluding to. The 3 days prior, the attack that killed 13 of our service members and a lot of Afghan civilians, it was believed that the method, or at least the container that had the explosives in it, was a computer bag. So the fact that on that day, on the 29th, we're watching this white Corolla, we saw an exchange of a computer bag. It wasn't lost on people to go, you know what? That's what was used to contain the explosives 3 days prior. And that is potentially indicative of, here we go again, another computer bag that contains explosives. True, I can understand that. But it could also be just a computer bag. And as it turns out, and we can affirm it, it was a computer bag, right? But you could see that correlation of, I've seen this movie before, and I'm going to equate it to that automatically. Now, it's not a one-off. That wasn't the thing that went computer bag, and therefore it's a target of interest. It starts to build on itself in multiple different settings throughout the 8-hour window to the point that it became, that is the target, and we've met the threshold to strike it.
Nancy Youssef?
Thank you. Sir, how many people were involved in the reading of the intelligence and the decision to strike? And also, on what basis did the U.S. determine that the target was a member of ISIS? And finally, you said in your second recommendation that one thing that needs to happen is that the U.S. needs to enhance its situational awareness. I guess I'm having a hard time understanding how much more awareness the U.S. could have after 20 years of war. You also mentioned that there was a disconnect in the strike cell where everyone wasn't aware of nuances. And so I guess my question is, given how long the U.S. has been in Afghanistan and how wrong they got this strike, why isn't the recommendation to revamp how such strikes are conducted? From what I can tell, you're talking about tweaks around the edges, but what you're describing are fundamental problems.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the questions, and I think I caught 3 of them. So in terms of the total number of folks involved in the strike itself, I'll get you the exact number. I don't have it off the top of my head, but it's quite a few. I think in the innermost circle of decision making and an assessment and analysis, it would be fair to say somewhere between 5 and 10. But there are broader folks supporting the overall strike. But we can give you a little bit more specific numbers if you'd like. On the assessment that the individual was a member of ISIS-K and or the locations, again, it was the correlation of what at the time was viewed as credible intelligence to what was being observed in real time. What I mean by that, let me just be specific. We have no reason to question the intelligence. What likely broke down is was not the intelligence, but the correlation of that intelligence to a specific house. The inference that what the intelligence is talking about is that house and that car. And there's an art to that. And that's where the disconnect and correlation broke down throughout the day. On the issue of awareness, I wasn't talking about enhancing overall U.S. situational awareness. I'm talking about enhancing the sharing information and the overall awareness of a pending strike or a high-interest track within the strike cell itself and the supporting elements. But you raise an interesting point that I should have raised. So the intelligence that we had that day, although significant, was also, should be common sense to you, right? We're exfiltrating the next day. So you can imagine the level of intelligence has been dramatically reduced by that point. We don't have Afghan partners on the ground. We don't have our own forces on the ground. So sources and intelligence streams are constrained. But that was obviously because of the fact that we were retrograding and the exfil was the very next day. So, but just to be clear, I'm not addressing situational awareness broadly about U.S. situational awareness and intelligence. I didn't assess that. I'm talking about intelligence within the strike cell, and they have to work with what they have. And they had a high priority and received. I didn't see any breakdown in receipt of intelligence. If it was available, it was given to them. But we have to acknowledge the intelligence we had, given that we're one day out from exfil, was not what we've been used to when we had boots on the ground and we had a lot of Afghan partners that could help us, and eyes and ears are very helpful.
How is it possible to say with 10 civilians killed and no terror threat eliminated that this wasn't a violation of law or the law of war here, given the level of this mistake? If the strike cell had more time and yet made the same mistake, is that a violation of the law or the law of war, or is it not time dependent and it simply wouldn't have been a violation of?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that question. It's important because it's not lost on us the severity of the outcome and the fact that we killed 10 Afghan civilians. But I don't have to tell this, you all know this, right? Mistakes do happen in military operations, and the assessment, let me tell you my assessment of how we walked through this. I'm trying to figure out, or what I did figure out, is were the interpretations at the time reasonable based on the information that they had? Were the associated decisions based on the information they had reasonable? Were they, if they were arbitrary, capricious, random? I ask, why did you think that was a threat? They had no intel stream to say that was a threat. They just made it up. I'm like, okay, that is a very different ballgame, right? You're now it's dereliction at that point. But when you look at a complicated operation like this, in a complicated setting that I described in the context of what is going on at any given day, and what they had available to them, and the time constraints of a perceived threat to U.S. forces, where we just lost 13 members, 3 days prior, in that context, I found, given the information they had and the analysis that they did, I understand they reached the wrong conclusions. But you could have said it's this or that. Was it reasonable to conclude what they concluded based on what they had? It was not unreasonable. It just turned out to be incorrect. So my point is, we've had mistakes in the conduct of military operations. Unfortunately, we'll have others in the future, more in the future. The issue here is to figure out what we could have done better to make sure this never happens again. I never found an instance where I ask a question of why did you decide that? And I got crickets, or I got an illogical answer, or I got no reason. I got a random decision. I didn't see that at all. And again, I wish I could share the classified information. I'm confident you would agree with me. It's just unfortunate when you're getting that volume of data, you're tracking so many threat streams, this confirmation bias thing starts to build, you're trying to interpret things the best you can, and you don't have time. Because I'm just telling you, just think about it this way. If this was a real threat, and it did kill U.S. forces on HKIA, and the folks involved didn't do anything about it, we might be investigating them today. So it's a tough scenario to be in, and it was a mistake. It was an honest mistake. It's important to say, throughout the investigation, everybody I interviewed under oath, I didn't have people saying, I thought it was this, and I was uncomfortable here, and I voiced a concern. By the way, I interviewed them separately. I didn't put them in a group, so there's no groupthink here. And I instructed them not to talk to each other, so there's no cross-feeding going on. And they all had a genuine belief, based on the information they had, and the interpretations, that that was a threat to U.S. forces, an imminent threat to U.S. forces. That's a mistake. It's a regrettable mistake. It's an honest mistake. I understand the consequences. But it's not criminal conduct, random conduct, negligence.
Thank you, General. So I just want to finally verify a couple of pieces of information with you. So the car that was targeted was at that moment, it was parked, it wasn't moving, right?
Yes.
and it was parked, I believe you first said 3 kilometers, but then you said 2 kilometers from the airport.
It's approximately 3 kilometers southwest of the airport. It started farther away, but throughout the day it moved and made multiple stops and ultimately got within 3 kilometers, and it was stopped. It was in a compound.
And then it was parked in a civilian urban area?
Yes.
Okay. So a car that was parked anything between 3 to 2 kilometers from the airport in a civilian area, can you help me understand how was that considered an imminent threat?
Yeah,
And
no.
the second question.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that.
It's a car parked in a civilian area, so by default, whoever was in charge of targeting it should take into consideration that there will be civilians, or the possibility of civilians, including children.
Yes.
How these two things happen, and I have a follow-up at the end, please.
Yep. So glad you asked these questions. So on the imminence of the threat, the fact that it was 3 kilometers, by the way, it doesn't take that long to move 3 kilometers and get to HKIA, but
During that period, my understanding is sometimes it took you like an hour to drive short distances because of the chaos in the city, and I was in the airport
Sure.
the day before the attack on the
Sure,
airport.
but so here's the critical issue, though. What the folks thought they were targeting at the time were a vehicle that contained somebody associated with ISIS-K, but more importantly, they believed the vehicle contained explosives. And here's the risk where people, the folks conducting the strike have to balance the risk to force, is if it contains explosives and it parks, and let's say it has S-vests, right, explosive vests, and they're removed from the car. I had a concentrated bunch of S-vests sitting in the car. The minute they're removed from the car and 10 people are wearing S-vests running around, it's impossible for us to neutralize that threat. They need to neutralize the explosives while they're aggregated. And they believed, although incorrectly, I got it, at the time, they believed, based on the intelligence, that that car contained explosive material. They weren't certain, was it S-vest or pieces of explosive material that could be inserted into a computer bag like the attack 3 days prior. But you cannot take the risk of allowing that, well, you could, but you can't overcome it. Take the risk of allowing those explosives that are concentrated that you can take out with one strike to get disaggregated and distributed very quickly, by the way. All they have to do is take it out of the car and you can't hit the same thing. So there was a deliberate decision of, I need to deal with this aggregated threat while it's concentrated. I can deal with it. On the civilian area, yeah, so it's highly unusual to conduct operations downtown Kabul, but again, self-defense and risk to force. But the report articulates measures that were taken to, as much as possible, mitigate the risk of casualties. What I mean by that is they thought that it cleared the compound. It's not like people didn't know the number of individuals in the compound. They were all convinced. Everybody we interviewed under oath, we listened to the communications of the strike, understood what was in the compound, unfortunately incorrectly, right? There aren't children there. That's one. The second thing is they attempted to minimize the collateral damage by, we got to be careful in classification, but the way you weaponeer a strike, you can adjust the fusing to minimize the collateral damage estimate. And they went to that measure, although they were executing it rapidly, they went to that extreme to go, let's try to fuse the weapon in such a way to dramatically reduce the collateral damage. So they saw the compound with relatively high walls. A gate is closed, so containing the blast. So to your point, it's not it's not like we showed up at the house and somebody destroyed the house. You could hear the comms of the weaponeering, what they're trying to do to mitigate the threat. They were convinced that the compound didn't have children in it. Turns out to be wrong, right? Had they not taken these steps, I might have reached a point, like your colleague was talking about, hey, what steps were you taking to try to minimize the risk of casualties?
You gotta move it along, buddy. You got one follow-up. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's quickly. On the question of the law of war, and I
On the
mean,
what? I'm sorry?
And the law of war. So
Yeah.
you said there were no violations here. I mean, Is it because there was no intention, because there was military necessity? Was it proportional? What I'm getting at here is, basically, in theory, any nation can claim impunity because they have classified information. They can talk about imminent threat, conducting something in self-defense, and say, we didn't violate any law.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think you all know the overall principles of the law of war of military necessity, proportionality, distinction, and discrimination. That's what I'm talking about when you're talking about that. And then specifically applied to this particular scenario, which is self-defense, the two key elements there to trigger that for necessity would be hostile act or hostile intent. So again, had I questioned the team and reviewed the material to go, there is no way on the planet any reasonable person would conclude that that is in any way, shape, or form a risk to U.S. forces or a threat. That would have been a very different outcome in the investigation. That is unreasonable. That is a violation. That is almost dereliction, right? Because it's random. But when you see the information that they have and the analysis applied, and you go, okay, I could see how they can get wrapped into this as the threat, not only a threat, but the threat. It was a mistake. It was a mistake.
Just a couple more, Lucas.
General Lucas Tomlinson, Fox News. Why were you looking at that car to begin with, and who approved the strike?
So again, need to be careful on classification, but the intelligence that we were receiving highlighted particular vehicles or types of vehicles, and also painted a picture of where the vehicles might go, and that such vehicles would be associated with the attack on the 29th. The reason we fixated on that particular vehicle is it correlated to some of these intel streams in terms of color and type, and then miscorrelation started to happen in terms of location. But it's not hard, again, if I could talk classified, to go, how did they correlate? You wouldn't be going, that is crazy. You're like, oh, okay, I can see it. It just turns out to be wrong. But that's how we started on that particular vehicle. Its make, color, and then its movements throughout the day and where it might have gone made it a vehicle of interest. I'm sorry, what was your second question?
Who approved the strike?
Yeah, the Target Engagement Authority is the Ground Force Commander.
Who is that?
It's Major General Donahue.
And are you also investigating the strike on August 27th in Nangarhar?
I am not.
Just a couple more, go ahead. Yeah. And on the car, was there actually a Toyota that was threat to the U.S. forces, or you just hit the wrong car, or was there actually non-existent? So the threat as a whole was
So
wrong.
to your question, I think I understand it. We actually never ended up tracking the actual Toyota Corolla. We didn't. It certainly wasn't the one we did track and struck. Well, we just didn't pick up the Toyota Corolla that we believe we should have picked up that might have been involved in something that was forthcoming.
There was also some intelligence officials speaking to the press saying that actually seconds after the launch, it was reported to the strike cell that actually the target is wrong. Have you seen during your investigation that there were certain attempts from the intelligence to inform the strike cell that actually the target is wrong, or just one single one?
No. So the initial indication that so every time you do a strike, you do a pre-strike analysis of what did we just strike. That combined with media coverage and for folks on the ground is how we first started to understand that there were civilians involved in this. But in terms of intelligence saying that you struck the wrong vehicle, that didn't happen. No.
Just to be clear on this, the thing you said about 2 minutes before the strike, when you reviewed the tapes, you saw that there were children.
One.
One child. In real time,
Yeah.
did anybody watching the feed see that child, or did all of this awareness come after the fact?
After the fact. So they 100% did not pick up on the child, and it's not because they said that. Again, I have their chats from the time preserved. We have their comms. We have their testimony under oath, and what they perceived to exist at the compound at the time did not include any women or children. And
Last question goes to Pat. Sorry, did I interrupt you, sir?
After the strike, they immediately came out and said there were subsidiary explosions that were so huge, could leave no doubt that it was a righteous target. How do you get that wrong? I mean, you're looking at the video, you would know if there was other explosions.
Yeah, no, another good question. So we did an analysis on that, a pretty detailed technical analysis to figure out for ourselves independently if that strike or what they perceived to be a secondary, and therefore, aha, we hit a weapons cache in the car, was just that. And the technical analysis concluded, which was shared prior, but we did our own, was no, the secondary was very muted and highly unlikely that was any explosives in the car. More likely that, I mean, we don't know what it was, but it could be a propane tank in the backyard, typical in Afghanistan, or something else. But to be fair, you could infer a little bit of confirmation bias in here, but to be fair to those observing the strike, I looked at it. There's a typical pattern of explosion when you employ the weapon that was employed on that particular day. And this one was more pronounced than normal. That's acknowledged by all, even anybody that looks at it to go, you know what, that's more pronounced than what we've normally seen. Everybody I interviewed under oath that saw the actual explosion said the same thing. We've seen hundreds of such weapon strikes, and this one seemed significantly more pronounced. I put eyes on it. It is more pronounced. But again, I'm not saying this is the cause, but you could infer into it, it's confirmation bias as well of slightly more pronounced, aha, we hit the explosives in the car. Could be something else, like I said, a propane tank in the backyard, in an Afghan backyard, or something else. But the conclusive analysis is it's highly, highly unlikely that we hit any explosives in that car.
Thanks, everybody. Let the general go. Appreciate it.
Thank you all. Have a good afternoon. Oh, you got more to do, right?
Yes.
That's right.
Unfortunately, I'm not doing
Yeah. Sorry, I drank water. Do I need to bring them over?
All right. Appreciate it. Okay, I know we've been at this for an hour, but I do have just a couple of things at the top here. As you think you saw yesterday, the White House announced a new comprehensive suicide prevention strategy to reduce military and veteran suicide. The strategy is built around 5 priorities: improving lethal means safety, enhancing crisis care, increasing access to effective care, addressing upstream risk and protective factors, and increasing research, coordination, data sharing, and evaluation. The strategy is aligned with the department's approach to suicide prevention and ongoing efforts, as well as including additional federal partners, which be the Departments of Energy, Justice, Labor, and Homeland Security, which will help us enhance interagency and public-private collaboration to address this very important issue. Obviously, we refer you to the White House for more information on this cross-sector, evidence-informed approach, but the department is honored to be a part of this larger effort, and I think you've heard the Secretary talk about the need to continue to do much more on suicide prevention. Today, I think you also saw the department released its 2021 report on military and security developments involving the People's Republic of China. You can find the full report on our website. The congressionally mandated report serves as an authoritative assessment on military and security developments involving the PRC. The report illustrates the importance of meeting the department's top-pacing challenge presented by the PRC's increasingly capable military and its regional and global ambitions. And then lastly, on a schedule note, I think you also saw the Secretary met today with the Singapore Minister of Defense, Minister of Defense Ung, at the Pentagon to discuss ways to broaden our bilateral defense cooperation. This meeting is their second face-to-face meeting following the Secretary's visit to Singapore in July. He and the minister today affirmed the enduring nature of the U.S.-Singapore defense partnership, as well as their shared vision of building an even stronger foundation for future cooperation. Secretary Austin reiterated the U.S. commitment to continued joint training and growing bilateral force posture opportunities with Singapore while collaboratively addressing security challenges in the Indo-Pacific. We'll have a much more fulsome readout of this meeting later today. And with that, we'll start with any questions. Sylvie.
Hello, John. The Iranians have said that U.S. tried to seize some Iranian oil, and they prevented it. And I wanted to have your side of the story to explain me what happened.
Yeah, I've seen the Iranian claims. They are absolutely, totally false and untrue. There was no such effort by U.S. naval assets to seize anything. What this refers to is back on the 24th of October, U.S. Navy assets did monitor Iranian forces illegally boarding and seizing a merchant vessel in international waters in the Gulf of Oman. The United States Fifth Fleet directed 2 ships and aerial assets to closely monitor that situation. At no time were U.S. forces attempting to retake or otherwise engage in the situation. We acted completely in accordance with the law. So it's a bogus claim.
Okay, they said that actually there were 2 tankers that the U.S. seized the oil from the first tanker and put it in a second tanker. You don't confirm that.
I not only don't confirm it, it's a ridiculous claim. It's absolutely not true. And I would add that Iran's actions, the ones that are true, of them illegally boarding and seizing a merchant vessel, constitute a blatant violation of international law that undermines freedom of navigation and the free flow of commerce.
Do you know the second?
The only seizing that was done was by Iran.
And do you know the nationality of the tanker they seized?
I do, but I'm not at liberty to say. I think we would refer to that individual nation to speak to that.
Can we stay with this topic? John?
Yeah.
So based on the video from the Iranian side and what you just stated, there were U.S. Navy assets and airplanes.
And I said that there
yeah,
were.
Yeah.
Monitoring.
My question is about the monitoring part. I mean, you have NAVCENT and you have the IMSCC. Combined together, their mission is basically to ensure maritime stability, security of the sea lines of communication, deter state-sponsored malign activity, reassure the merchant shipping in that region. I mean, evidently, the U.S. didn't do any of that. I mean, where's the assurance and where's the deterrent effect of your presence?
What I can tell you is we acted in accordance with international law, unlike the Iranians, and I'll leave it at that.
So there was an intentional effort not to escalate the situation.
We acted in accordance with international law, unlike the Iranians, and we do believe our forward presence in that part of the world has and will continue and can continue to act as a deterrent. Does it deter every action by the Iranians and particularly the IRGC Navy? No, but it's one of the reasons why we're there, to help, as I said, support freedom of navigation and free commerce. That's one of the reasons why we have a naval presence there, as well as many of our allies and partners. But we acted in accordance with international law. And I think your question would also be well put to the folks in Tehran.
Our correspondents in Tehran did. My follow-up on this is, why did the Pentagon wait until today to come out with its version of what happened?
There was no waiting, Fadi. We were monitoring. We monitor a lot of activity in that part of the world. It was not about waiting. We are reacting to false claims that the Iranians made today. So if you're asking me why am I talking about this today, because you're asking me about it today, because the Iranians lied about it today. But we monitor maritime traffic every day out there, and not all of it rises to the level of us putting out a press release or talking about it overtly from the podium.
Why?
Patty.
If you look at the video, those small ships, small boats were really close to that destroyer. As you know, and we know after the cold, that was a huge concern. Did the captain, did the crew do anything to try and sort of swat away the small boats? Were they allowed to do anything, or is the order to avoid escalation?
I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there, Patty, so I'm not going to speak for the commanding officer of a destroyer and what force protection measures they might have taken. What I can tell you is that the commanding officers of our ships always have the right of self-defense and multiple ways to defend their ship and their crew. And they know they have those authorities. They know they have those capabilities. Now, what actually transpired aboard that particular destroyer, I wouldn't get into. I'd refer you to the Navy or to the Central Command to talk about that in more detail. Yeah.
Was there any possibility that the ship was engaged in piracy of any sort, or illicit oil transfers or anything like that?
I don't have any additional information about the ship that the Iranians illegally boarded and seized. And again, I just don't have more.
I'm just wondering why we were tracking,
Why we were tracking.
yeah, why we were tracking the ship.
We monitor a lot of traffic in that part of the world. Yeah, Abraham.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. I've got two questions. One on the China military power report. Who went to the Hill to brief, and who did they brief? And I guess there was like a classified briefing. Could you kind of provide a little bit more detail on that?
I don't know if I have the exact details of who briefed whom. So let me take that question. I just don't have that level of detail here. But obviously, this is a report mandated by Congress, so we had an obligation to brief appropriate committees and appropriate people on the Hill, and we did that. But exactly who did it and when, I don't have that level of detail.
Okay, so second question on the, as you know, Air Force released some COVID exemption vaccination requirement. Deadline was yesterday. They released some numbers about that. I wonder if Secretary Austin is pleased with the Air Force's effort to get vaccination. Are there lessons learned? Does he talk regularly with the service chiefs about how they are conducting their vaccination efforts on deadline? Can you kind of elaborate on his role in that?
The Secretary is pleased by the level of effort that the military departments have taken to enact this mandatory vaccine regimen. As a matter of fact, he was encouraged by the activity by the military departments before we had to make the vaccine mandatory. And as you know, the Delta variant, the much more lethal Delta variant, really contributed to his decision to go ahead and make this a mandatory regimen. But yes, he's pleased by the leadership of the department. He is aware of their progress, and each of them have a different set of deadlines, both for their active component and their reserve, and in some cases their guard components. He respects those differences. They are keeping him informed. As a matter of fact, there's a regular update to Deputy Secretary Hicks. So she too is staying right on top of this issue as we move forward.
So that 10,000 number for the Air Force at the deadline, that's okay for.
I didn't say that I didn't say it that way, Abraham. I said he's comfortable and pleased with the leadership that the military departments are showing here. He's not unmindful of the fact that in each of the military departments there are some members who are declining, refusing to take the vaccine, some that are applying for exemptions, some exemptions that are being granted. And he trusts that the leaders of the military departments, the service secretaries and the service chiefs, will continue to manage this mandatory vaccine regimen in a compassionate and a professional manner. That's what he's comfortable of. He continues to believe that these vaccines are safe and effective, and he continues to want to see every member of the armed forces get the vaccine so that they can be safer, they can be more ready, and that they can contribute to more ready units. And frankly, that they can help contribute to the health and welfare of their own families and the communities in which they live. So he absolutely, nothing has changed about his desire to see every member of the armed forces get vaccinated. Obviously, excluding those who, for medical purposes, at their doctor's discretion, are not able to. But short of that, he wants to see everybody vaccinated.
Thanks, John.
Yeah. Go ahead.
On Turkey, Turkey is insisting that the U.S. must cease its support to the Syrian partners, SDF, and they have reinforced troops in Syria for possible attack on your Syrian partners. What is the Pentagon's position on the Turkish request?
Our position with respect to our cooperation with the SDF has not changed, nor has our mission in Syria, which is solely focused on the ISIS threat. That threat remains. Those missions continue. That cooperation continues. Anything else in the back there?
Thank you, sir. Army General Stephen Townsend, Commander of U.S. AFRICOM, and the Assistant to the President for Homeland Security, Dr. Sherwood, recently visited U.S. personnel in Kenya, Djibouti, Somalia, and Niger. Are there any more, they talk about counterterrorism, are there any plans to add more U.S. troops to those regions in Sahel and East Africa?
I have no troop announcements or personnel changes to make with respect to our posture in Africa. As you can probably tell from the agenda of that trip, there is a lot to talk about. There are a lot of partners doing a lot of critical work in the counterterrorism realm, and General Townsend remains laser focused on that, but I have no troop announcements to make. Yes, ma'am.
Can you characterize in sort of an overview of how the discussion went this morning between the Secretary and
That was a very good discussion. Again, follow up to our visit to Singapore in July and the Secretary's first meeting with the minister and with officials there. There is a lot of things, and you'll see this in our readout. We'll have more detail on the meeting in terms of cooperative initiatives that we are going to undertake going forward. But we have a strong bilateral relationship from a defense perspective with Singapore, and we look forward to deepening that going forward. Okay, thanks everybody.